here.
Not likely. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very glad this isn't a debate format, because I think this question is so complex, and I think most of us have such contrary views on this. It's a very good thing that it's not set up as an either-or thing. The first thing I would say, but I agree very much with what Fawaz just said about that Cameron point. I entirely agree. I thought it was an absurd, indeed obscene thing for a Prime Minister of the UK to say that ISIS is an existential threat when it's no such thing. However, I do have to push back a little on something that Simon has already said. Terrorism can do serious damage. And as everybody knows, just from that one thing that's already come up twice this evening, the attacks in Paris in November 2015, it still is doing damage. Still, the Parisian economy, the tourist economy is not recovered from that. It's still a city suffering from that. Now, I don't know how you could get into a situation where multiple suicide bombings go off in the nearest capital city to this one, where multiple suicide bombings go off at a football match, at a rock venue, drive-by shootings, Kalashnikov attacks in cafes and restaurants, and that wasn't reported, or it just was mentioned, and we all got on with our lives. The public want to know that information. We want to know, I'm going to go to Paris next weekend. Is it a wise idea? Is it good to go or not? Of course we need this information, and we need the media to be reporting it. And I have to say that we have to appreciate what the end point of Simon's point of view on this is. In 2013, when two British converts to Islam, two very radical young men, ran over in broad daylight in South London, in this city, ran over a soldier at home on leave from Afghanistan, Drummer Lee Rigby, hacked at his body in the middle of the road, tried to get his head off with machetes, and so on. Simon described that as a mundane act of violence. Now, I don't think that is a mundane act. It was in your Guardian column at the time.
Oh, sorry.
Anyhow.
It was a mundane act of violence.
But, you see, for most of us, the general public, we don't think that the reporting of a soldier being decapitated in broad daylight by two such men is a mundane thing. It is certainly an act of violence, but we have to be very careful. That is the end point of dismissing the terrorists, of saying we don't give them any oxygen. We try to get around it in some way. Now, I think, by the way, that the censorship around terrorism already exists to an enormous extent in our societies. The media in this country and in America and elsewhere don't show anything like explicit images of the aftermaths of terrorist attacks. And there is a very good argument that actually if the public saw what those of us who've covered and seen attacks have seen, that their views on this would be a lot harder than they currently are, and that the media actually holds this back from the public, and that as a result the public are less enraged than they would otherwise be by this. But you know, if you support the motion tonight, how would you do it? How would you stop covering the terrorists when they carry out an attack in Paris for night and kill 130 people and leave many more wounded for the rest of their lives? How would you do it? How would you do it in the age of the internet? Okay, it's plausible you could get a press regulatory body so rigorous that it stopped the remainder of the print press from publishing any information about it. People would go to the internet. How do you shut down the internet from covering this? Now, having said that, there's one very important point on this, which is that obviously the press have to show restraint. And I want to give you two very quick examples in my life of the press clearly not showing restraint on this. And this is where there will be some unanimity on the panel tonight. In 2004, when the British-born man Ken Bigley was held hostage in Iraq by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's group, many of you will remember this. There was a drip feed of information on an hourly and daily basis by Zarqawi's group. And they knew, and we knew from the moment that American forces ended up getting into his compound, that his group were watching the British media like hawks, because Tony Blair was being personally held responsible by a man being held hostage with a knife to his throat. And if you remember, that man, Ken Bigley, was saying on camera, "I blame Tony Blair." And the British press were blaming Tony Blair. And there was a moment there where the combination of an extremist group and the British press effectively helping them could well have brought down a prime minister in a democratic society. It came very, very close at that point. And the second example I would give was 10 years after that, in 2014, when Jihadi John, as he was called, Mohammed Emwazi, another British citizen, was executing, murdering, beheading people in the Syrian desert. I would argue that was another time when the British press needed to show restraint, and a lot of it did. You'll remember that The Independent ran a front page saying that we are not showing the photo of this. That may have been an extreme example, but the British press, once again on that occasion, the international press, were being used by that group to have this drumbeat of terror. So on that, I think there'll be some agreement. I think that the British press, by and large, does show restraint. I don't think we cannot cover the terrorists, but there are occasions when the press in this country and elsewhere has got it very badly wrong.
Well, so let me ask you, you bring up Jihadi John, and I think this is an interesting one. Why give him a nickname like Jihadi John? Why not call him by his name, Mohammed Emwazi?
Sure.
Why do we have to come up, the very idea of coming up with nicknames? And also I wanted to ask you about a distinction between covering ISIS propaganda and terrorist attacks. There's a big difference between running their videos of them with the black and white flag, saying the Shahada, and showing what happened in Paris, right?
Yes, there is. No, there's a very big difference between the two. And sometimes we fall into covering both as if they were the same thing. But as for that, the nickname point is a very good point. I'm slightly bemused by it myself. Of course, we didn't know his name was Mohammed Emwazi when we knew that he existed and he was the decapitator. So he had to be given some term, I suppose. I do think that the sort of weird jokiness of it is...
The Beatles, I think, coined the term in the British press.
I don't know why people do it. Maybe it's a coping mechanism about something very grotesque.
Douglas Murray discusses the lasting impact of the 2015 Paris attacks, emphasizing how terrorism can still affect the economy and society years later. He criticizes the notion of terrorism being dismissed as mundane, arguing that media restraint sometimes prevents the public from fully grasping the severity of such events. This censorship, he suggests, may hinder a more robust public reaction. How does media coverage shape our perception of terrorism and its impact on society?
You can't just simply say, it's like another story.
Okay, Douglas, do you agree with that? Is there essentially a synchronicity going on, or a symbiosis between ISIS or groups like ISIS and the media? Are they kind of playing into each other somehow?
Yes, they are. I mean, we know the extent to which people, for instance, in ISIS use the internet to see what their coverage is like, that day. I mean, there are cases of this. So there's obviously a synchronicity. I think, by the way, that the whole thing plays into a thing which, I mean, it's not just on this subject, but on any subject. What is the normal routine in the media now in the era of 24-hour news? Something happens, you need somebody to react to the something, then you need somebody to bring on the story. But every journalist, anyone who's ever worked in journalism will know this, you get a call from BBC, CNN or something. The Prime Minister said this about this happening. I wonder if you'd call for this. And you think, well, no, usually. Usually it's, in politics, it's somebody calls for somebody's resignation. That's another kick of the wheel. The story goes on a bit longer. Now there have been calls for the resignation of this person after this thing that's happened, and so on and so on. So there is a momentum to all news stories. Keep pushing it forward. And the reason why, I mean, personally, I don't watch if you don't mind me saying so, the 24-hour news after any terrorist attack, because something terrible has happened, and one doesn't learn very much about it by the presence of said major reporter standing some miles away, from the scene. Or the best one, not to be too light-hearted about it, but it wasn't the terrorist attack. You'll remember that when that Russian submarine went down, Donetsk, some years ago, the BBC ended up renting a helicopter to fly over the sea to show a bit of sea. And then on air, it turned out that they weren't allowed to fly over the bit of sea which the submarine was under, because the Russian authorities had ordered a blockade over the airspace. So the BBC, just at enormous expense, had covered a bit of sea like the bit of sea.
Murray explores the symbiotic relationship between ISIS and the media, explaining how terrorist groups use media coverage to further their agendas. He highlights the 24-hour news cycle's role in perpetuating stories and how this constant coverage might inadvertently serve the interests of terrorist organizations. In what ways can media coverage of terrorism be balanced to inform the public without amplifying the terrorists' message?
Expand on that a bit. You know, is there an argument to be made? We've heard President Donald Trump come out and say, we're not covering terrorism enough. And to all of us who work in news, I think we were like, you must be taking the piss, was probably the first reaction. Yeah. And then they provided this list of, you know, I mean, various attacks in Europe, many of which, in fact, we hadn't covered because they were incidents where maybe one person was stabbed, and because the threshold is probably quite high at this stage for it to become a, you know, leading a news broadcast. But
you didn't do enough on Sweden, did you?
But do you think there's an argument to be made on the other side that we're not covering it enough, that we're trying to sanitize it, that by not showing the images, as you said, that by not sort of, you know, going over every single incident?
Well, can I, firstly, the press already, the media already does a fair amount of editorializing before you even get to the discussion we're having. Let me give you one example. ISIS, which is the subject of Fawaz's book.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hold it up again. No, I'm not. I've got a 10% deal on this. ISIS now the main broadcaster here in the UK, the one that we all pay for, the one that is, I think, responsible for the fact that our media is not as divided as it is in, for instance, in America. There's much to be said for the BBC. The BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State, as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group, what they actually want, and what groups like them want. But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished a book which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. So the media doesn't cover the story. Okay, you could say, well, who cares about Sweden, or it's just, you know, it's just this. But the fact is that it's the non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha, 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 it's so hilarious. Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible...
Murray responds to claims that media does not adequately cover terrorism, discussing the editorial decisions that shape news coverage. He points out the lack of in-depth reporting on groups like ISIS and criticizes the media's occasional failure to address significant societal issues, such as those seen in Sweden. Should media outlets prioritize in-depth coverage of the ideologies and goals of terrorist organizations over sensationalist reporting of their attacks?
Values in Western societies.
And Douglas, I mean, you know, the third question I thought was really interesting as well, because it touches on an issue that we haven't got into very much tonight. But because semantics matter, the very definition of this word terrorist that we bandy around so freely, but which I think means many different things to many different people, it has become synonymous with Islam somehow in the minds. It has been falsely collapsed, as you have said, in the minds of many people, to the point now where an American man goes and if he's white and takes an AK to his nearest shopping mall or goes into a African American church and kills 12 people, he's not called a terrorist. He's called deranged or disturbed or And I wonder, Douglas, if you have any thoughts on the idea of how we appropriate the sort of how we use this term terrorism and who we choose to call the victim of a terrorist attack and who is just the victim of a lone wolf. Or
if I may just make 2 points on this very quickly. One to the lady up there. I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much about the coverage of terrorist attacks that have a proximity to where we are. This always happens after a terrorist attack now. People say, why, as far as says, why have you got so much attention on Paris and less on Beirut? It's because Paris is Paris and Beirut is Beirut, and Paris is near us, and most people feel more kinship, and they've probably been to Paris, and more people have been there than they've been to Beirut. You can always play this game. It's regrettable, but it's not only us, in our country that feels like that. When something happens near you, it's of more import to you than if it happens far away, and sadly, the Middle East feels far away for most people, and so of course that's going to be the case. We might regret it, but it's not unnatural that's the way in which the things are covered. Secondly, on this thing, as it were, about motivation, there's another thing that happens now after any terrorist attack, which is it happened recently of what was it? There's a sort of graphics that get sent around Facebook, social media, Twitter, all that kind of thing. The number of people killed each year by, I don't know, lawnmowers versus the number killed by terrorists. Everyone has a great chuckle. You're more likely to be killed by your toaster than you are by and all this. And that also sort of skews the whole debate because. I don't deny those stats in certain countries. By the way, they always tend to be, things like how many people have been killed in America by terrorism since the 12th of September 2001?
Six
that
people.
Sort of, yeah. But the point is that this is so you guarantee, it always starts on a certain date that helps the statistic, as it were. Because if you did it 24 hours earlier, you've got to put in 3,000 more people, and so on. Same with Paris. They don't pass around the Paris death toll statistics on the same amount because they're not as sort of giggly for a bit. But again, I don't deny that a toaster can be dangerous or a lawnmower, but if there were a movement deliberately making dangerous toasters, or deliberately miswiring lawnmowers to make sure they kill their owners, I'd want to know about it, and so would you. And that's what we're dealing with, movements that actively want to do this, and so of course...
Murray examines the semantics of the term terrorist and how its usage has become intertwined with Islam in public discourse. He discusses the disparity in labeling perpetrators based on their background, pointing out the inconsistency in how similar violent acts are reported depending on the assailant's identity. How does the inconsistent use of the term terrorist affect public perception and policy toward different communities?
We're all standing up for the West, and this is a kind of a clash of civilization.
Douglas, I want you to respond to that, but I wonder if you can do it also in the context of answering the gentleman's question, which was about this idea of we can editorialize and use this, nice bit of sophistry that kind of takes the edge off of things and makes us all feel quite happy with it. But are people then just going to go to social media where they can hear the real tough talk and, cut through the bull, as Americans would say?
Can I answer that first, if I may? We live in an extraordinarily perilous time in general with information in this regard at the moment. And let me give you two very quick examples that don't have directly to do with the thing we're discussing tonight, but which speak to it. The way in which you can now pump a lie or a rumor straight into the mainstream news is far more worrying than I think people are aware of. And let me give you two very quick examples. 18 months ago, when a Conservative Party donor who was disgruntled that he hadn't been given a place in the cabinet for his cash donations, releases a biography of the then Prime Minister, making the most lurid possible claim with no source that any newspaper in this country would stand up and publish on the back of, about something the Prime Minister was alleged to have done as an undergraduate at Oxford. Those of you who know, I'm not going to repeat it. But that was said in a book published by the author at the author's expense, the disgruntled former friend of the Prime Minister's. He managed to pump that claim directly into the system of the British press, and it was on the BBC and everywhere. Why? Because the papers know that if they don't repeat the allegation that is baseless and so on, it's all over the internet, and all their readers are going to go over the internet. Let me give you another example of that. A claim made before, or around the time of the recent election, no, after the election, before the inauguration of Donald Trump, about allegedly compromising information from the Russians. Without saying any speculation about where it comes from, again, a story which normally a newspaper would not be able to run because there's no source for it, there's nobody backing up the claim, is put into a website which then is so lurid that it goes all around the world, and before you know it, the Times of London is reporting the lurid thing that nobody ordinarily would pick up because it's on the net and they know that all of their readers are going to disappear onto the net otherwise. So if that can happen with these sort of grotty, innuendo stories, we have to consider how vulnerable we are in general to much more serious stories now. And I think that dividing line has become very, very dangerous. Just very quickly to respond to the point about Fawaz about this. I'm a bit more sceptical than you are about this because, I mean, over 3 presidents now since 9/11, they've all taken a different tack, and the response has pretty much been the same. Nobody likes to remember this, but what was the first thing that George W. Bush did as president after 9/11? He went to the Islamic Center in Washington, read his favorite bits of the Quran, and insisted Islam is a peaceful religion. This has nothing to do with Islam. Okay, no, and everyone, of course, subsequently, nobody gave him credit for it, but that was George W. Bush. Barack Obama refuses to say the term Islamic extremism when a man shouting Allahu Akbar at Fort Hood kills a dozen Marines. It was described famously as workplace violence. And so this thing comes up. What are they holding from us? Why are they lying to us? We can see what it is. Why are you not saying that the guy shouting Allah is greatest whilst gunning people down may be doing it for theological reasons? And you start to do the contrary thing. And that's why you now get, as I say, this situation. It's the same thing, as I say, with the migration, with European politics and all this stuff. The public aren't onto nothing when they're worried that the media is holding some of this stuff back from them. Barack Obama was berated at the UN by David Cameron for this. It was Cameron who said at the UN a year or so ago, it's not enough that you say it has nothing.
Murray warns about the dangers of misinformation and the ease with which false stories can enter mainstream news through the internet. He provides examples of baseless allegations gaining traction due to their online presence, highlighting the vulnerability of modern media to manipulate and the implications for democratic societies. What steps can be taken to safeguard the integrity of news in an era where misinformation can spread rapidly online?
Responsible for this thing. They're not.
Okay. Question number 3, we're going to move on from this topic because we can spend all night on it, and it's a fascinating one. But I just want to get to the lady's question here, which is a really good question. Is not talking about it an answer? Are we somehow, in the same way that everyone said when Donald Trump finally came out and said radical Islamic terrorism and the world looked exactly the same as it did 5 minutes earlier, if we all just stop talking about it, is it going to make a difference?
No, and the rhetoric matters, but obviously it isn't everything, as the President is finding out. I mean, obviously you have to have a viable policy behind it. It's just that people are quite rightly worried that an absence of rhetoric, or at least apparent, unwillingness to get right into the weeds on it, is part of the problem. It just would suggest that you might not actually want to be grappling with it. It's like, I don't know, it's like when you speak to someone, you say, how would you deal with terrorism? And they say something like, we've got to deal with poverty. And you think, oh, God, well, we'll do that one soon, I'm sure. And so, I mean, it's so vague as to be obviously meaningless. As I said, it's obviously, to my mind, not viable. I mean, you can't tell people not to worry about something that's very near them. And my own view is that for some time, Americans have been overheated about this. And I think Europeans have been slightly underheated on it, actually. But just very quickly, if I may, there is another reason we haven't touched on yet, but it is a market force within journalism which we haven't dealt with. In the same way that there was a period when the British police seemed to find it most useful to be on Twitter all day, and finding people who'd aired on Twitter, and people wondered why this was the case. And I was saying, well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's much nicer to do that than to go and find robbers and things. It's sort of more restful. In the same way, for journalists, it's much nicer to report this sort of the cycle than it is to go onto the ground and do the stuff and actually get people interested in stories which they didn't know that they would find interesting. I came back from northern Nigeria the other week where I was researching the massacres that are taking place there. And, you know, there's not much interest in this country in Nigeria. But part of the reason is that the British press don't send journalists to these places. And so you get around to say, well, journalists don't want to read about Nigeria, you know. And so it becomes all part of it very, very quickly. Another very interesting point of this phenomenon and the complexity of where we are in it. Look at what became the picture of the year at the Press Awards ceremony the other day. The photograph of the assassin of the Russian ambassador in Turkey standing over the body of a man who was who was alive only seconds before. Standing over that. Now that was all over the press. And we had no problem with it. It was a dead Russian on the floor by a live, heated... and when you consider that the British press has no problem doing that, but absolutely, you know, pardon my French, you know, needed to change its trousers over reproducing a cartoon a few years earlier, you realise the sort of craziness that we're in.
Yeah.
You know, you're taking your life in your hands if your publication...
The discussion shifts to the impact of rhetoric and policy on terrorism. Murray emphasizes that rhetoric alone isn't enough. Viable policies must be in place. He also points out the reluctance of journalists to report from dangerous areas, leading to a lack of public interest in important stories, like the massacres in Nigeria. Thank you for joining us. We've tackled some challenging topics today, but remember, the key to progress is through open dialogue and understanding. Stay tuned for more insightful discussions as we explore the most pressing issues of our time. Remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.